This is our teaching video for Baptism of Jesus 2014. I was looking at our old videos. We've almost done a year of teaching, and so it's been fun to do this and to learn some new things and to refine the style, and hopefully we'll be able to do that more this year. In preparation for the Baptism of Jesus, if you want, you can turn to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 42, verses 1 through 9. This is actually the first of the servant songs, so-called, in which Isaiah describes someone sent by God to establish God's justice and do God's work. The second reading is going to be from the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, verses 34 through 43. This is when St. Peter gives his astounded speech to the household of Cornelius after their conversion. And then, of course, we have to have an account of the baptism of Jesus, which will be found in Matthew, since we're in the year of Matthew, verses 13 through 17. Well, before going into Isaiah, a little bit touching on Acts and then really getting into Matthew, I want to remind you that we're in a new season in the church, the season of Epiphany. And Epiphany is just a fancy Greek word talking about the manifesting of God. So where God is made manifest, where God appears, where God is revealed. And so there are going to be several weeks in a row in which we discuss stories about God being made manifest, God revealing himself in the person of Jesus. Now, when we talk about God being made manifest, it really leaves us a question, which is this a God we would like to meet? Or when God is revealed, are we disappointed? Or what kind of God is revealed? This is why the first servant song in Isaiah 42 is so important, because the servant songs give us the contours of who God is and what God is about. So who God is, this is an important basic question, and God's mission. What is the work that God is going to be about? And when we read the imagery from Isaiah 42, Christians have always been fascinated by these, but especially over the last 100 years, because it's almost as if in the prophetic work of Isaiah, we start to get the eruption of God's deeper mission that will culminate in the person of Jesus. Well, to answer that question of who, Isaiah gives us two very powerful images. Isaiah talks about the servant of God coming and saying, "A dimly burning wick he will not quench, a bruised reed he will not break." So the first thing we can say about the God that we're dealing with is this God is gentle. And so imagine that the end of this candle wick that's now smoking, almost extinguished, he does not come and put it out and say, well, there was nothing we can do. He comes very gently and he tends it. Maybe this is an image you can identify with. Maybe your faith feels like the candle wick, where it's almost dying. It's just a little bit of an ember, maybe where once it had been a flame, more smoke than fire. Well, the one who is God's servant, the one who comes to bring God's justice, does not come to punish with a kind of ham-handed violence, but no, comes and tends very gently to those who may be in need. This is the second image, and it's the image of the bruised reed. So we see a reed here that's been bent and broken. Not broken all the way, but now certainly will not grow in the way it was first intended. Now, oftentimes, if you've been around stuff like this, we just break it off and say, oh, the heck with it. At least we can clean the branch up a little bit. But no, the one who comes, he doesn't break the bruised reed, he tends to it. And so when you think of human life being marked by a certain kind of injury, or human life being marked with a certain kind of brokenness, God comes to tend to those wounds and to bring healing. And so sometimes we forget that when we ask this question, who is God and what is the mission of God's servant, that these two pictures from Isaiah, I think, can be very comforting. If we're going to ask that question of who, Isaiah gives us a wonderful answer when God says, I am the Lord, that is my name, my glory I give to no other. The interesting thing about this section from Isaiah is it reminds us that not only is this God gentle, but God's work of justice is comprehensive. So God doesn't just come as like a nice friend, like, oh, you're a nice guy. Too bad the world's worse than you are. No, God comes as the one who loves, and God's love will in fact be all-encompassing. And some of the imagery we get as it relates to the mission of this God is blind eyes will be opened. Those who are imprisoned will be set free. We're not just talking about people who are just sitting in prison. We're talking about people who are sitting in a kind of solitary confinement. So we might even say the whole. Like if you've ever gone and visited Alcatraz near San Francisco, and they put you in solitary confinement and close the big metal door, and it's pitch black. And then occasionally, they might open the little pinhole for light, or kind of blind you when they open the door, and have the fullness of the day shine through. But we're talking about people living in a kind of darkness, whether it's the darkness of blindness, and not just physical blindness, but spiritual blindness, or also being imprisoned, sitting in a dungeon, sitting in deep darkness. Well, when we turn to the reading from Acts, we kind of get a deeper picture of the mission. I mean, that's really why it's called Acts of the Apostles. We see the mission unfolding after Easter. Now, it's a story, or the context of the story is there's a Roman centurion named Cornelius, who he and his household are baptized, and Peter's standing there kind of open-mouthed, that someone like a Roman centurion would be baptized or would be welcomed by God and the Spirit. So we might say that the Roman centurion points us to the comprehensive nature of the mission. And we're not just talking about, hey, let's deal with the small population of people here, let's deal with this small population of people over here. The mission is so vast that it actually deals with everybody. Now, interestingly enough, the way the mission is accomplished, says Peter, is on the cross. So for us to talk about the baptism of Jesus, as we will, for us to talk about the implementing of God's justice, we have to talk about the cross, and we have to talk about Easter. So crucifixion and death, and also Easter and resurrection. And so Peter gets right to the heart of the matter when he talks about anointing Jesus with the Holy Spirit and with power, how Jesus went about doing good and healing those oppressed by the devil, how he was put to death by hanging on a tree, and God raised him on the third day. Now, one of the things we have to talk about really to cover everything that Peter talks about, in addition to the cross, and in addition to Easter, is we're also going to have to deal with his talk of the devil. Because if we think about who is the one imprisoning people, at least spiritually in Isaiah, who is the one imprisoning people, at least spiritually in the Gospels, who is the one that spiritually imprisons human beings, well, the Bible and the Church's theology, even though maybe now it's become less popular than it has in the past, is the devil. Or we could say Satan. Now what I want to do is kind of connect this together in the baptism of Jesus. So we want to talk about the mission of God, we want to talk about the servant of God, we want to talk about dealing with the devil in the act of baptism, and then also reflect on our practice as a church. Now you see on your screen a picture of an Australian crocodile, a saltwater crocodile, and you see on the back wall there that his name was Sweetheart, and quite a large beast. He was famous in the 1970s outside of the city of Darwin, Australia, for attacking small boats. And he never attacked people, and he didn't even really attack boats, but he certainly attacked their motors. So he was famous for chomping on outboard motors, and when he was captured and anesthetized, he actually drowned. So now he's stuffed and put into a museum. But he was famous for a period of years as this crocodile, kind of funnily named Sweetheart, who was sort of a danger in the water. Now, an Australian director actually took Sweetheart and turned the story into a movie called Rogue, Welcome to the Territory, and certainly took some liberties with who Sweetheart was, because now you see it's not an outboard motor, but a person. And this image from the movie poster is one I want you to think about as it relates to the baptism of Jesus. So often the imagery of the baptism is fairly tame. It's Jesus standing there, almost like Jesus is just performing a perfunctory religious ceremony. Yeah, I guess we should get baptized. And let's be honest, I mean, oftentimes in the church we sort of perform it as a perfunctory ceremony. But what I want to get at, and what the church has taught from its very early days, is the idea that there was something dangerous in the water that Jesus had to address. There's something dangerous in the world that Jesus had to subdue. And so when Jesus walks into the River Jordan, imagine it like this poster, that Jesus is the one there sort of swimming freely in the open water, and then the one who comes to grab him is the devil, or actually the word that was used often was Leviathan, the monster, the sort of prehistoric monster that exists in the Old Testament, and the one in whose head Jesus will stomp. It actually wasn't uncommon for Christians in the early era of the church to use this verse from the Psalms, so it's actually a quote from the Psalms. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave him as food to the creatures of the desert. And I'm pretty sure this is Psalm 74. Now what I want you to notice is actually we have the plural heads, And if you're in a Revelation class or you've read some of the apocalyptic books, these creatures are often multi-headed dragons. And so imagine Sweetheart the crocodile with more than one head. And the idea is there are dangerous monsters in the world, and they exist in dark places, and they are kind of the predators, and human beings are the prey. And part of the gift of what Jesus brings, part of the justice that God wishes to establish, part of opening eyes and setting people free, is crushing the head of the monster in the water, and simultaneously doing it in a way that's gentle to human beings. So we kind of have this comprehensive picture of the mission of God. Okay, on your screen now is a picture of Jesus, actually an icon, an Eastern Orthodox icon of Jesus and his baptism. And so now if we kind of take what we've said so far, we can explore the meaning of his baptism and ours through the end of this video. So the idea of Jesus going into the waters then is necessary if there are dangerous things in the water, and if that danger to human beings is this kind of monster, Leviathan, or if the danger to human beings is the devil who enslaves and keeps them, then the baptism of Jesus, he goes into the water to make it safe for us. He goes into the water to make it safe for us. This might explain why John the Baptist says, why are you getting baptized and not baptizing me? And that's a good question, because if baptism ends up being freeing people who are enslaved, freeing people who have been marked by sin, and so on, why would Jesus need to be baptized? And it's not because he himself requires baptism, it's because he himself is preparing the water for us, addressing the dangers therein. Now, of course, water is significant in the church's history. And what we want to do now is kind of uncover moments in the story where water has played an important part and how it ties back to what Jesus has done in his dying and rising again. Two foundational stories in the Old Testament that have to do with water are the flood and the Exodus. Now, if you listen to our own baptismal rite, we use Martin Luther's flood prayer as part of our service, and it's kind of this ancient recounting of how water has been used. And we have to say this, that as it relates to the flood, water is dangerous. And not only is water dangerous, but water represents the power of death. And this is a fairly consistent representation of water in the Bible, that water represents something dangerous, something chaotic, the power of death. And so it's no mistake that God creates out of the forces and begins to separate and make order out of the forces of chaos at the beginning of Genesis. And the flood represents the danger of death to the whole human family. You know, the water that washes over the earth is not a cleansing water, unless you think it's cleansing the earth of human life. But the funny thing is, you know, that oftentimes we'll like decorate nurseries with Noah, and we think about the animals and 2 by 2 going to the ark, and that's not the point of the story. I mean, there is the sense in which God rescues people from death, but really Noah and the ark and the flood is probably the last story you want to expose children and babies to, if you think about what it means. But there is a sense in which the cleansing water is dangerous, but also allows for newness after death. And so we might say that the flood is an imperfect symbol pointing us to what's going to happen in Jesus' dying and rising. Now, the Exodus is important because we have the journey from slavery, and in the book of Exodus it's to Pharaoh, but in the church's teaching it's to the devil. And then they go through the water of the Red Sea, and for the Christian, that's the water of baptism, and then they go to the Promised Land, which is the place of freedom. And of course, for us, this is church, and not just the church on earth, but the church in heaven and the heavenly place. So, two foundational stories dealing with water also get kind of brought into Jesus and his baptism. He's preparing the water so that when we're washed over with the power of death, we will not have to be afraid and we will not have to be alone. Make no mistake, baptism is a kind of dying. Baptismal water has a kind of destructive force. But the destruction that we experience is already connected to Jesus on the cross. And so even that darkness, even that hardship, even that brokenness is tied into God's redemption. We might say this is really the genius of Christianity. God takes that which threatens us, God takes that which destroys us, God takes that which is difficult for us and finally overwhelms us, and God sets us free through it. So baptism and the baptism of Jesus is a prefiguring already of his own death, is the prefiguring already of his resurrection, passing through the water to the promised land, passing through death to Easter. And this will be the same for the Christian. One final note, you'll notice that the baptism is an epiphany in an important way. And it's an epiphany of the Holy Trinity. The Holy Trinity is not something Christians just made up and kind of interpose on the Bible. It's actually, after centuries of reflection, it was the way the Christians said, you know what, this appears to be who God is, and not just in the New Testament, but throughout the whole Bible and history. And so the baptism of Jesus, if you're like, I don't really get the whole Holy Trinity thing, I don't get how it's possible, 3 in 1, 1 in 3, if nothing else, you can kind of just enter into the story. We have a Father who speaks through the torn sky. We have the Son who's named and who obeys, so the Son goes on the mission. And then we have the Spirit who rests on the Son. And so you might say that the Holy Trinity is just the Church's way of dealing with the data we've received. We've received this data of a voice who speaks and says, this is my Son, and then Jesus who says, I am the Son, and I can point you to the Father, and then the Holy Spirit who not only rests on Jesus, but rests on us in baptism as well. And so really, Epiphany, in the season of Epiphany, is for Christians to really reflect on who is the God who's accomplishing all these things, and what is the unique witness that Christians offer to this God. As a kind of postscript, think about this for yourself. When were you baptized? When did that happen? What were the circumstances? Who was there? What was the date? Because that's the date in your biography where you entered into this drama, where you entered into it in a very personal way. That same water passed over you. That same Spirit came onto you. You were united to the death of Christ and also the promise of new life. And indeed, the one who has called you, the one who has marked you and claimed you, is the one who very gently deals with broken reeds, with smoldering wicks, and promises new life. We'll see you on Sunday.